Welcome to the Affirming Minds Podcast, where we equip like-minded mental health professionals with a therapeutic toolkit that helps add to a more engaging, fulfilled, and effective mental health practice. Each empowering episode can stand alone as a continuing education pod course or a very valuable professional or personal resource with insightful expert interviews, practical resources, industry news, and lots of inspiration. We help the modern therapist thrive at work. Now let's welcome your host, a dedicated therapist and passionate educator, Shayna Cyber, LCSW.
Welcome to the Affirming Minds Podcast. I'm your host, Shayna Cyber. Before we dive into today's episode, I want to take a moment to share some important disclaimers. This podcast is for educational purposes only and should not be considered a substitute for professional treatment or clinical supervision. If you're in need of those services, please reach out to a licensed mental health professional. Confidentiality is always a priority. Any clinical examples shared in this episode are de-identified, composites, or clinical vignettes, ensuring that no real client or patient health information is ever disclosed. If you're interested in earning continuing education credits for listening to today's episode, visit affirmmentalhealth.com to learn more about our membership options. Our membership includes CEs for live virtual workshops, self-study webinars, and pod courses via the Affirming Minds podcast. Today, we're diving into an incredibly important and timely conversation, the realities of migration, trauma, and mental health among unaccompanied minors. These young people have endured extraordinarily difficult journeys, often fleeing violence, persecution, and poverty, only to face systemic challenges upon arrival to the U.S. As mental health professionals, educators, and advocates, we need to understand how to provide trauma-informed care, navigate systemic barriers, and advocate for their well-being. To help us unpack this complex topic, I'm honored to be joined by Brenda Punksy, LCSW. Brenda is a former human rights lawyer and a current trauma-informed psychotherapist with a wealth of experience supporting unaccompanied immigrant youth and asylum-seeking families. For the past 8 years, until just a few months ago, Brenda was the advocacy director and a senior-level psychotherapist at AFFIRM, a unique medical legal mental health partnership embedded with Montefiore Hospital's Bronx Health Collective. AFFIRM provides trauma-informed care specifically designed for unaccompanied minors and asylum-seeking families, addressing the complex intersection of legal, medical, and psychological needs. Now in private practice, Brenda continues her multifaceted work by providing trauma-informed therapy to individuals, couples, and families specializing in traumatic stress, complex trauma, attachment, and acculturation stress. She also conducts psychological evaluations to support asylum and immigration cases. She trains professionals across medical, legal, and mental health fields on trauma-informed best practices and how to avoid re-traumatization when working with migrant youth. And she provides mentorship and supervision to legal teams and mental health professionals working with asylum seekers. Brenda has also made significant scholarly contributions, co-authoring research on mental health and medical legal partnerships for asylum seekers and the impact of family separation at the border. She has collaborated with ACLU, conducting psychological evaluations of asylum seekers stranded under the migrant protection protocols in Matamoros, Mexico, and has worked with the United Nations working groups on Nicaragua to evaluate victims of torture by the Nicaraguan government. In addition to her master's in social work from NYU, she holds a law degree from both NYU School of Law and Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico. She is also a conflict mediator certified by the New York Peace Institute and was honored with NYU's Global Social Work Award for her outstanding international social justice work. I'm so excited for this conversation because Brenda brings such a rich perspective, blending her legal, clinical, and advocacy expertise to help us better understand and support unaccompanied minors. So let's get started. Brenda, thank you so much for being here on the Affirming Minds podcast. I am so thrilled. I've been really wanting to have a conversation with you as we're recognizing the incredibly tense political climate we are in, which has a lot of anti-immigrant sentiments, and thinking about how that is translating into our clinical work and what we're thinking about in treating certain communities. Maybe can you just start by introducing yourself to our audience and telling us a little bit about how you came to this work today we're going to be really focusing on working with unaccompanied minors and how that relates to immigration-related trauma. So I'd just love to hear how that became a passion of yours.
Sure. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very honored to be here today. So I have really always been interested in the migration experience. My four grandparents are each from a different country, and they all migrated to Mexico, where I was born and raised. So I am a second generation Mexican. But I also migrated to the United States, to New York specifically, about 16 years ago. I am an immigrant myself. In Mexico, before migrating, went to school and became an attorney. I worked as a human rights attorney for a few years before migrating to New York. In Mexico City, I worked as a human rights attorney investigating human rights violations of government officials to civilians. When I moved to New York, was specifically to study a master's program for international attorney. And it focused on international legal studies and specifically on international human rights law. After that, I did work with different nonprofits in New York, always related to human rights and social justice, before deciding to go back to school and becoming a psychotherapist and social worker. And so after I graduated as a social worker, I knew that I wanted to continue on that path of providing services to underserved populations and always related to human rights and social justice. And I enrolled to go to a conference that was about migration and specifically unaccompanied immigrant children, a term that I had honestly never heard before. I went to the conference. I was so fascinated by the work that this organization was doing and by the experiences of unaccompanied immigrant children that I said, I have to be part of that. I want to work in this field. So I actually went to the presenters after the conference ended. I went to the presenters of this particular topic and I introduced myself and I asked them whether they were maybe hiring social workers at the time. I was very lucky. I was in the right place at the right time. And long story short, I ended up working for an organization soon after that.
It's fascinating to just hear how you came to those work. Anything that's been particularly impactful about doing this work for you?
So I worked with unaccompanied immigrant children for about 9 years, now 9 or 10 years, and with asylum-seeking families as well. And each and every story that I hear, each and every experience that is shared by a patient is usually very, very impactful in many ways, especially as a reminder of how resilient people can be. Now, in terms of impactful experiences as a therapist, a common experience as a therapist is the first person that a patient tells their traumatic experiences ever, which doesn't necessarily reflect my abilities as a therapist, but rather a lack of an adult that the child may have had trust in or trusted enough to share it with before, or a lack of appropriate environment that they could have felt safe to do so, to share their traumatic experiences. This was something that happened all the time. Also, seeing like a shift in the way that a patient is able to trust not only me, but themselves in their story, the way that they befriend their story over time. For example, I had a 23-year-old male patient from Guatemala. And as we were terminating treatment after a few years of doing therapy together, he said that I was the best friend he had ever had.
Wow.
That's a very endearing thing to me. And again, that doesn't necessarily speak about my abilities as a therapist, but rather as something that we created together, as one does uh, when there's a good match of therapist and patient. It's something that we worked on together, and we were able to achieve this level of trust and closeness.
Absolutely. And I know you're going to tell us a bit more about what that migration experience, what that journey actually looks like for many unaccompanied minors. But I just imagine the isolation that must be so prevalent. And like you said, that a lot of the systems you have to interact with, probably there's so much understandable mistrust. So to actually have the safety of an adult that creates some environment that can just hold that experience must be such a relief. So I'm not surprised that it lends itself to just creating such a strong attachment within the therapeutic relationship. Um, can you describe maybe, I'm sure typical might be like a challenging word in this term, because I know that there's probably so many variations depending on the many variables of the unaccompanied minor in terms of the genesis of why they need to leave, where they're coming from, their developmental age, and strengths and vulnerabilities. But to the best of your ability, could you give our listeners maybe a sense of what a typical journey of an accompanied minor might look like, and what are they undertaking when they're coming into the United States? What are some of those risks and challenges that they are enduring along the way?
Before we talk about the journey itself, I think it's important to just note or to talk briefly about the reasons why they are migrating, because the traumatic events and the experiences don't start when the journey starts. Then they start as reasons why people flee their countries of origin. And so some of the most prevalent reasons why people end up migrating or fleeing their country are repeated throughout the unaccompanied immigrant children population. And I would say asylum-seeking families as well. And they include targeted violence, especially towards youth, ethnic minorities, and especially girls and women. We see a lot of extortion, a lot of forced gang recruitment of children. I can't tell you the amount of children or of patients that I've had who the gangs try to recruit them. And I'm talking about 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 10-year-olds from a really young age. We also see a lack of protection and the corruption and impunity from the government. So there's a generalized sense of like violence is normalized.
Mm-hmm.
And so there a general sense of a lack of protection from the government.
Yeah.
We see a lot of abject poverty and social exclusion, labor and sex trafficking, and especially for new arrivals, also pandemic battered economies and climate change and political unrest. These are some of the main themes that we see as reasons why people migrate. So even without setting foot on the immigration journey, people are already experiencing and adding a burden on their backpack of traumatic experiences that they're going to encounter at a very young age.
Yeah. And I'm so glad you brought that up too, because I think that's often so lost in these conversations around policies of what are the forces that are driving people to, why would people undergo such a challenging, difficult, financially challenging, physically challenging, emotionally challenging. And when you're talking about some of these environmental and social conditions, recognizing that there is so much unsafety, structural trauma, interpersonal violence, where people are trying to make the best possible choices they have of the ones available, which sounds like in many of these cases are incredibly limited. And talking about these things that we're all in with different levels of privilege and vulnerability, of course, but climate change, human trafficking, these are universally, unfortunately, shared issues that we do not have good solutions, and recognizing that people are going to, of course, do what they need to the best of their ability to survive, as we would, I think, expect any of ourselves for ourselves or for our children would do. We're going to do the best we possibly can to endure horrific circumstances. Yeah, thank you for setting up that context. I think it's incredibly helpful. And then when that decision is underway, that, okay, we have to leave. Tell us a little bit about that piece.
So it's interesting because if we're focusing specifically on unaccompanied immigrant children, which, by the way, I don't think I define exactly who they are, but they are the ones who are under 18 years old when they cross the border. And when they do so, they do not have a parent or a legal guardian with them at the time of crossing. It doesn't matter if they came with the aunt who's taking care of them since the day they were born. If the aunt or any other relative is not the legal guardian, they're going to be considered unaccompanied and separated. And that can have implications later on for the legal things. But thank you for mentioning this part about like making the decision to leave. Sometimes they do have a say on whether they leave or not, but many other times they don't. Sometimes they are either, especially if they're very young, they are not told exactly why or what's going to happen. If they're very young, I had several cases in which they didn't tell the children they were leaving. It's just, you're going to go with this person, this woman or this man to this place, and then they don't know what's happening until they're already in Mexico. Or they tell them, yes, you're leaving tomorrow, or you're leaving right now. And in those situations, there's no space or time for goodbyes, for packing, for closure, like in big quotation marks. And so you can imagine the impact that this is going to have later on in their adaptation, or it's another burden that they add to the backpack of stressors or trauma that they'll carry with them. But okay, let's imagine that it's either them who decide to migrate, or many of them are forced to migrate. They may have had a very traumatic experience, or they're being threatened or persecuted, or a relative or their best friend was killed, or they are being threatened to kill them if they don't participate with a gang, or they don't do this, or they don't do. So their lives are at risk, and a decision is made, whether by them or their parent or someone else, that they are leaving their town, their city, their country. So when that happens, the journey in general is frequently characterized by harsh and life-threatening experiences. Many migrants set out with no understanding at that time of what they're getting into. They don't understand the terrain or the geography or the social conflicts that lay ahead of them. So for those who are not in, I want to talk about this journey in two sections. One is for all of those who are not in Central America or Mexico. So this is those who are coming from Western African countries, from South America, from the Caribbean, from Dominican Republic or Haiti. They have an added burden because they first have to get to Central America in order to continue their journey up north. For them, they often have to come through something that's called the Darien Gap. The Darien Gap is part of the Isthmus of Panama, and it's a narrow swath of land dividing the Pacific Ocean and the Caribbean Sea. Parts of it are so inaccessible that when engineers built the Pan American Highway linking Alaska to Argentina, only one section of it was unfinished, and it's 66 roadless miles of turbulent rivers and rock mountains and venomous snakes, and it became known as the Darien Gap. So it sits at the border of Panama and Colombia. It's on the in Panama side, but it's right at the border with Colombia. Government officials are largely absent from this Darien Gap, and the area is controlled by a criminal group known as Clan de Golfo. It has, of course, grown into a multi-million-dollar business, just like the whole migration, not only this section, but the whole migration business. And so one of the characteristics of crossing the Darien Gap is that it's extremely dangerous. Because it has turbulent rivers and rock mountains, there's a lot of mud and mudslides. If you're with your family or someone and somebody in your family falls into a river, this can be your parent, child, or sibling. If they fall into the river and the river takes them away, there's nothing you can do about this. Nothing you can do. Some start the journey as families, but they lose family members along the way, or they get lost. This part of the journey is done by families and unaccompanied immigrant children, and families include children as well. I have a few numbers that I thought were very interesting. In 2022, more than 32 children crossed the gap. In 2023, more than 3,000 unaccompanied and separated children crossed it. And in 2024, over 30,000 children crossed in the first 4 months alone.
Wow.
Those 4,500 were unaccompanied and separated children. So it's really risky and really difficult. There are tons of pictures and videos now about this experience, and it's really heartbreaking because you need to be very desperate in order to go through that. You must really not see or not have other choice.
Yeah.
It's really dangerous. Now, if they make it out alive, they make it across the Darien Gap, they are in Central America. Panama is Central America too, but they reach the other side. Now they continue their journey north. Now, to get from Central America through Mexico and to the border with the United States, but the methods of transportation used are the buses, a lot of walking. They often say that they walk for days at a time. Sometimes they use car ride, and very often they board a train that's called La Bestia, or the Beast, or also called the Train of Death, where there's constant risk of falling off and mutilation. It's a really dangerous part. The whole journey is very dangerous, but that's like
one of the particular challenges that's imminent death or injury or something is, yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. And yeah, so some of the things that that I hear that people report that happen there is that they experience exploitation and extortion and violence, hunger, a lot of sexual abuse, kidnapping, both by drug cartel and others, and exposure to the elements, to extreme heat or extreme cold or rain. So it's a really tough journey. Now, after surviving all that, the ones who survive it and make it all the way to the border, many present themselves at what are called ports of entry. So imagine there are doors to the United States, and they go to the port of entry and they express their fears of harm if they are returned to their home country. So they explain why they need to enter, why they cannot return to their country. Many of them are simply turned away, especially during the first Trump administration and during the pandemic. Many were told that because of national public health emergencies, they couldn't come in and they were turned away. So they have to live in refugee camps on the Mexican side of the border. And camps are in very bad condition. They are gang infested and people living in extreme fear. It's not only the reports that talking about when I say this, but I was in one of them myself, doing mental health evaluations of people stranded there at the border. This was as part of a litigation done by the ACLU. And I still don't know what the professional word for very creepy is, but that's how it felt. It was, they're not good places to be, or for children to be, or for families to be.
Right. Just to take a step back for a second, because it's just fascinating, this incredible process. These people have just endured such a physically, emotionally devastating journey to get here. Many of them lose family members or get separated along the way, as you mentioned. And I think for people who the current climate of immigration and like talking about legal pathways, it sounds like that process you're talking about in terms of the port of entry is these are people that are trying to seek asylum, which is a legal pathway to status in the United States. And from what you're describing, it's not necessarily that they don't have legitimate asylum cases. It's whatever the political climate at the moment may be, whether it is more open or restrictive regarding the immigration policies that dictate where people will land after making this incredible journey where they of course can't just turn around and go home, not like you didn't get through these entry points, so here's a plane and you're gonna head back, left with no options, and then left in these sort of eerie refugee camps. Okay, so just wanted to review that process, and so that's really fascinating that you've had experience in those facilities that are provided, and it sounds like they're very eerie, suboptimal living conditions, particularly when we're thinking about the journey of children and adolescents.
That's right. And I wish I could say they were facilities, but they are just
That was too generous, way too generous, right? They're in just open elements, right?
If it's raining and they are on soil, so if there are floods, then it's going to get flooded too. So yes, the conditions are really difficult. And another thing I wanted to state is that seeking asylum is a right people have that is included in U.S. law as well as in international law. And in order to request it, you have to be inside the U.S., like in U.S. territory. It's not something you can ask before coming in. So one is to come in and then you can request asylum.
Yeah, which is such an important caveat because it sounds like it's leaving what are the options of people to access legally seeking asylum, given that some of the catch-22s that they're being put in order to do.
Exactly. And so after, again, surviving all that, so people go and they sometimes go through the ports of entry and they request to come in so that they can request asylum, and often they're turned away. So sometimes people stay in these refugee camps for a little bit or for long, like people have been there for a really long time, but very often it's people who don't have any more money. They may have already kidnapped them twice. They may be dehydrated, they may be sick, they may be hungry, or have children that have any of that. So if we're talking about unaccompanied immigrant children, they can themselves be definitely all of that. So many people become desperate and they decide to cross the border without inspection. When they do that, they have to go through the desert and the river. And many people die of either drowning or of dehydration while crossing the border. Some examples of things that patients have told me told me repeatedly, is that they hear and feel animals in the middle of the night, like when you're walking, or when they're resting. They're walking for days at a time. They sometimes see bones and dead bodies along the way, just like you would in a horror movie. But imagine if you as an adult would be like scared by that. Imagine a child.
Of course. Yeah, it's horrifying.
Horrifying. And then all the patients that I have had, regardless of age, have expressed being terrified of the animals in the river, that they're going to be beaten or eaten. If they make it across the river and they didn't die of dehydration or drowning. They cross the river and then they are in U.S. territory. Now, they typically get apprehended right away, or they look for Border Patrol, or La Migra, as they're called, by themselves to turn themselves in. Not only because they don't receive water and food and maybe medical services if needed, but also because there will be a record that they entered the country when they were younger than 18 years old. And as I mentioned, this is going to have later an impact for them to be able to regularize their status. They'll have more chances if they entered as unaccompanied children if they are adults.
You mentioned that if they came in with another adult who is not their primary caregiver, like an aunt or a family friend or a cousin, that there is a required separation. And what is the rationale for that?
The rationale, I can't tell you very well. A lot of things that I can't explain very well because they make no sense to me. I imagine in theory, it's, I don't know, if to protect them or to... Yes, I can see in some cases, if a child is being trafficked, for example, yes, they separate the child from the trafficker. That's a good idea. But this happens also when they are coming with someone who is their family, who they have been raised with. And so this separation, especially at a younger age, is very difficult and can be very traumatic.
Like they just have survived this incredible ordeal of getting over, and now it's like the person that they know that is like their safety. Now that it's going to be another separation, another trauma to endure. And I think it's just so interesting how some of the narratives around immigration versus the realities of immigration are strikingly different. Just even something like as simple as people are not evading and hiding and sneaking in. They're looking for Border Patrol. They're looking to be apprehended because, again, these are being fueled out of like desperation and survival, not like exploitation of our services. Just like the way it's being portrayed. And these are really stories of human survival and that the willingness to live and persevere, and people who are just, they need the most basic things to survive. They're just, it's one step at a time, just trying to endure. So really incredibly helpful sort of reality testing that needs to be done and be more widely understood public knowledge.
Yeah, I think it's very important to talk about them a little more in depth. They are apprehended by Border Patrol. Then they're first taken to a place that is called La Hielera or Icebox, or La Perrera or Dock Canal. La Hielera because of the freezing temperatures, and Dock Canal because it looks like one. And this is the first placement where they're going to be after apprehension. Some of the experiences that patients have shared with me while they're there, they shared with me experiences about their experiences while they were there, are that there are bright lights on the ceiling. I mean, they stay on during all hours of the night. There are no windows. It's very hard to get any sleep. The floor is hard and cold. There is no privacy. The children are crying, understandably, and coughing all night long. The food is bad and scarce. There's lack of medical care. Many of the examinations are conducted by law enforcement officers rather than by medical doctors. And they are frequently limited to checking for lice, scabies, or chickenpox. So they'll stay here between 2 and 4 days. But it's in these processing centers that they are going to first be asked for the first time about their story. So it's the first opportunity they'll have to share the story of why they are there, why they are fleeing, and why they cannot return to their country of origin. But because of cumulative and complex trauma, children are often afraid to tell their stories, and they're unable to trust authorities. They are very used to not being able to trust the authorities back home who have uniforms. And so this is like their one chance to explain why they're there, but because of trauma, that can be very challenging to do. Many are scared that the information that they provide is going to go back to their countries of origin and endanger their communities or their families, friends. And so if they are able to share their story and believe that they have a credible fear of persecution if they're returned to their work, then they will be transferred to shelters that are part of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Now, the Office of Refugee Resettlement is part of Human and Health Services, which is child welfare. So it's no longer the Department of Homeland Security. And it's important because there is a shift in training and in the way that children are taken care of. There's a switch in the people who work there and their way of working and their focus and their training. So they're going to be held in these facilities, in these ORR shelters, until there's an investigation on which sponsor that is already in the United States the child can be released to. I'll talk about who they are more in a second. I just want to share about the experiences of these shelters. Children are provided with dorm-style rooms, and they have shared bathrooms and showers, hot meals, education services, recreation activities, and they may receive medical and mental health care while in custody. Of course, that is limited too, but they do receive all of this. And so the average time that they stay here is between 34 to 60 days. Yeah. It varies. It depends on how long the background check on the sponsor takes. After an investigation into the sponsor is finished, they can be released to a sponsor. Now, these sponsors can be a biological parent, another relative, it can be an aunt, it can be a grandparent, or it can be someone that is not a relative. It can be the neighbor of the cousin of the friend that is doing the parent of this child a favor, and they are receiving them here. But sometimes it is the biological parent. So sometimes the parents have been here for a few years, and now they are reuniting with their child. But it really depends. For example, those who come from Guatemala tend to be released to other siblings.
Yeah.
In my experience, many from Honduras, for example, were released to their biological parent. But it can really vary. And this can really vary not only the kind of sponsor that they are released to, but also the kind of relationship, if any, that they have with the sponsor. So it can be someone that they have known their entire lives, or someone whom they've met twice. And this can be a relative. It can be an aunt who went to visit El Salvador twice when they were 4 and 6 years old, and then they never saw them again, and now they are 16. So they're released to the sponsors and out to their new lives, to anywhere in the United States. Every single state in the United States has received unaccompanied immigrant children. So now that they are released into the community and living with the sponsor, all children and adults that are placed in court proceedings to determine whether they're eligible for legal relief that will allow them to lawfully stay in the United States. But the burden is on them. So even though they are released into the community, they are placed in immigration proceedings to determine whether they're eligible to stay or not. It's not like they are just the door opened and they're free to go and to live in the United States. No, they are able to live in the United States while their case is determined whether they should be deported or not.
Do they need some sort of anchor that already has legal status in the States?
That's a really great question. And the answer is no. They do not need to have lawful status in the United States. What happens, and gonna happen now even more is that they do need a background check. And now they're also requesting, and this is very recent, they're also requesting the sponsor to have their fingerprints taken and their DNA tested. And given the current state of affairs, which I know we'll talk more about in a bit, people are even more scared to do that.
Right.
So that causes delays in the time that children are left in these shelters. And also, one thing that I find fascinating, for lack of a better word, is that they'll be there until the sponsor is able to pay for transportation for the child to wherever they are. So they may need to borrow money for bus fare or for a plane ticket,
So you're saying the children could be going to Washington State, to Hawaii, to New York. This might be incredibly expensive travel fare. And given the state of the current immigration restrictions in terms of sponsorship, that having people being willing to make themselves vulnerable and providing sponsorship or the financial costs increasingly become a barrier. What happens when sponsorship cannot be identified? Is it they're just languishing in these facilities potentially indefinitely till they age out? Or do they get absorbed by another system? What does that look like?
great question too. Sometimes when that happens, after a long process, they may be placed in foster care.
Mm. Yeah.
Foster care or in temporary foster care, or there are different other placements depending on the states too.
Absorbed into the child welfare system more broadly, foster homes or group homes. In the majority, they're trying to find sponsorship. That is the pathway that they're trying to do. Yeah.
And I think it's very important to know also that while they're waiting for the immigration case or immigration proceedings to happen, they do not have the right to a government-appointed counsel. They must represent themselves in court, which has a lot of implications that I'll talk about in a little bit. That's part of the stressors that come.
And that's like regardless of age, like a 7-year-old would have to represent themselves in court.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. We started to touch on some of the ways policy kind of shows up and can impact these experiences. What is the current state of immigration policies in the U.S. Concerning unaccompanied minors? And you mentioned the sponsorship requirements in terms of background checks and fingerprints and things like that. Anything else that's notable, either in just like the current state or any changes that clinicians should be aware of?
Yes, there is so much happening in terms of immigration. We saw this administration has signed a lot of executive orders related to immigration. And of course, I can't go through all of them, but I think what's important to know is that most of them apply to unaccompanied immigrant children as well.
They're not making a distinction between folks over the age of 18 and 18-month-old or toddlers and young children.
Not something happened recently related specifically to unaccompanied immigrant children, which is a recent memo. It's a memo that was released now in February, and it's an ICE memo that claims to aim to ensure that children are not victims of human trafficking or other forms of exploitation, but it directs immigration agents to track down hundreds of thousands of unaccompanied immigrant children, expanding this administration's mass deportation effort. The memo said that if there are deportation orders pending, if there's a deportation order pending against an unaccompanied child, the child will be served a notice to appear in court or be deported. So the memo is directing agents to focus specifically on the unaccompanied children deemed flight risk. And these flight risks include those children who had a deportation order because they missed their court hearing, and also those who were released to adults who were not blood relatives. And this is very problematic because there may be many reasons why a child may miss their hearing. They may have changed addresses. They may not have given the correct address at the beginning, for example. Or the sponsor may have moved. There are a million reasons why children may not make it to their hearing, including being fearful of being caught and deported. And also the sponsors being afraid of the child going and being deported, or the sponsor being deported themselves. So there's a lot of fear related to everything immigration-wise right now.
Yeah, and you're talking about these just such complex systems. You're talking about people coming from all over the world that speak different languages, different dialects, different ages. On top of that, probably different mental health comorbidities, pervasive trauma. This idea that things are not going to get lost in translations, these seems like such complicated processes and orders. And then, as you mentioned before, the trust issue. That's so unfortunate that it's like giving such low tolerance for mistakes or people being fearful about the process.
Yes, they unfortunately, unaccompanied children are also affected by the changes in immigration policy. And as I mentioned, there are some specifically targeting them in particular. So it is very important to keep updated on what is happening, although acknowledging that there's so much happening that even for people who do this for this kind of work, it's really difficult to keep track of everything that's happening.
Yeah, I think that's just the overwhelm, and then things like getting just like confusing and overwhelming the system, and that just making it so difficult even for staunch advocates and policymakers and community organizers. Like, it's, how do you go into mobilizing problem solving if you can't even get your head around what the problem is yet? What are your thoughts about the political rhetoric that are surrounding these immigration issues, and what is the impact that has on the mental health of immigrant children and their families? Of course, there's just like a very widely covered case in the news about the suicide of a young child who's being mocked by her peers and taunted about ICE raids and threat of deportation. So is there anything that you're seeing as, how we're talking about this communally and these policy shifts coming down, and what is the impact that it's having on children?
Yes, many patients, both children and adults, but including children, have become very scared of being deported or their families being deported. And so they're afraid to leave their house, even to go to work or to medical appointments or other kind of appointments, or to go to school themselves, or adults to send their kids to school. There's a lot of fear about a lot of things that are happening right now. A patient, for example, she gave birth just a few weeks ago, and she is very scared of being deported, of being separated from her newborn child, and of her child being stripped of her U.S. citizenship too. Because fortunately, that has stopped, at least for now, but there is so much happening that there are a lot of changes that may impact.
So this also looming threat about citizenship at birth, and that sort of being, unfortunately, part of this public discourse of what is potentially at risk here.
And I've also seen an increase in anxiety symptoms and also triggering memories of persecution back in the country of origin. So let's remember, many of them have already experiences in their country of origin being persecuted or having to hide, scared to leave their house for different, very valid reasons. And so now they are in a situation that it's not exactly the same, but it has a lot of similarity with that. Of course, that's going to have an impact on mental health.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think part of what is so sad is the dehumanizing rhetoric around the people that have immigrated to this country. And what do you think some of those myths or misconceptions that the public holds about immigrants and specifically about unaccompanied minors that are particularly harmful that would be really important to dispel?
Yeah, there are several common misconceptions about unaccompanied children that shape public perception and policy debates too. And so some of the most prevalent ones are, one is that unaccompanied minors are mostly teenagers looking for jobs. They just came here for economic reasons. The reality is that many unaccompanied children are young children, as young as 5 or 6 years old. So they are young children who have traveled alone, or at least crossed the border alone. And many of them are fleeing violence and persecution, trafficking, or extreme poverty. They're not just seeking work. Another myth that I see is, or misconception, is that they cross the border illegally and should be deported. As we mentioned before, they often turn themselves to immigration authorities themselves, and they are legally entitled to seek asylum or other forms of protection under U.S. and international law. Another one that I often hear or read is that their parents are irresponsible for sending them alone. The reality is that many families face impossible choices, either to keep their children in life-threatening conditions or send them to a safer country. As I mentioned before, some minors are fleeing gang recruitment and domestic violence or child labor, and they have no family or anyone else to protect them in their country of origin. I've also heard that they are a public safety risk. We know that there's no evidence that they commit crimes at a greater rate. In fact, data shows that immigrants commit crimes at a lower rate than native-born citizens.
It sounds like they have all of this intrinsic buy-in to not have interactions with the legal system. And some of what that's going to do is you're on your P's and Q's. You're going to try to be law-abiding and staying under the radar. Sounds like when these very rare exceptions to the rule happen, they're just so widely disseminated in the public sphere that it really becomes a quick manipulation of the truth. Just a question about the actual deportation process. When a unaccompanied child is, especially in this climate where it sounds like it's more aggressive, what does that look like when children are deported? Especially, it sounds like in so many of the cases, the vast majority of cases, they're fleeing persecution. So they're essentially being sent back alone to the countries that they fled. And I imagine it's different based on where they're going back to, but they have to just start at square one with no support or adults with them in that process of return.
That's exactly right. And now we're seeing that the government is doing deportations to other countries that don't have anything to do with the country of origin of the person. There are a lot of people who were just recently deported to Panama that have nothing to do with Panama. They're not Panama nationals. It's a big mess, and it's really endangering the well-being of children.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So what specific training or competency should therapists develop to support unaccompanied minors dealing with complex trauma?
The first thing that I would suggest is to learn about the impact of child and adolescent trauma in development. So understanding how trauma affects brain development, emotional regulation, attachment, and what trauma responses and reactions look like in general. I also suggest complex trauma training. One of the mental health conditions that we see the most is complex trauma, PTSD, attachment disorders, depression, etc. So definitely learning more about complex trauma is going to be helpful when working with this population. Also, trauma-informed, evidence-based therapies, narrative exposure therapy, EMDR, somatic therapy techniques, relational therapy, family systems therapy, TFCBT for specific cases, not necessarily for cases where there is cumulative complex trauma, but also learning about basic understanding about immigration law. So learning about asylum processes and the different kinds of immigration relief that may be available for unaccompanied children. There's one in particular called the Special Immigrant Juvenile Status, which is for children who have been abused, abandoned, or neglected by either or both parents, either in their country of origin or in the United States. That's one of the immigration beliefs that I've seen the most with patients. Also, of course, cultural sensitivity training, working with trained interpreters and developing basic skills in key languages of the children that we work with, Spanish or indigenous language, depending on what population you're working with. And of course, adapting the interventions to reflect cultural values and resilience and healing practices of different migrant communities would be my recommendations.
Yeah, absolutely. And how should therapists address issues of acculturation stress and identity formation that may be coming up in minors?
So I would say, first and foremost, always keeping in mind the incredible power that normalizing and validating their experiences it has on, well, not only on children, but on anyone really. Normalizing and validating experiences past and present stressors too. Teaching them the difference between normal and traumatic stress is very important. Supporting bicultural identity development. So encouraging the integration rather than assimilation. So helping children see value in both cultures. Validating the ethnic pride while also addressing internalized stigma, which we see a lot of that. Teaching coping strategies, including mindfulness exercises, is very important. And creating space to explore their life in their country of origin and the differences between their current life and what they experienced before, and what like the differences and similarities and what they like and dislike about both lives, which make their identity or their experiences. And if you feel inspired, to all of everybody that is listening, you can create a peer support group for unaccompanied immigrant children where they can share their experiences. This can be very helpful.
Yeah, that sounds like an amazing sort of resource to have available. I think one thing I'm hearing coming up a lot for healthcare workers, for clinicians that are very concerned about this onslaught of policy and how do they keep their clients safe? How do they not make them more vulnerable to deportation or unwanted legal interactions? So in terms of like confidentiality, documentation, mandated reporting, what should clinicians and maybe healthcare workers be thinking about when working with this population, particularly at this moment of intensified vulnerability?
It's such a great question too. It's very important to explain the confidentiality limits clearly. and taking into consideration the age and the language, and explaining them in a way that is clear is very important. Also, making sure that they understand their rights, including that they can stop therapy at any time and that it's not mandatory. Knowing their rights, both in terms of therapy, but also it depends on whether people are working at clinics, for example, but encouraging their clients or their patients to attend Know Your Rights trainings, because they'll have very useful information of what to do in case something happens, in case they are in a raid, in case ICE goes to their home or to their school. So not being informed is really important. Now, in terms of, it's important also to protect sensitive immigration details. Disclosing their immigration status can put them at risk. So what I always have done is I do not write their immigration status anywhere. Not on note, not on charts. There's no need for that. Also, just like you would with any other child, you report abuse, neglect, or trafficking as required by law. And I think those are the most important that I can think of.
Yeah. I think just that simple thing, just to make it clear, it's don't document their status. That's just like the easiest thing across the board, to just don't. And like you said, the importance of that informed consent and being very clear. I think as you mentioned, they're already being distrust with navigating legal, like authoritative services, whatever they look like, people in uniform, and that could by proxy extend to healthcare systems. And just being very clear upfront about, I think, just acknowledging that, and then being able to really talk about the limitations and the mandated reporting status, so they can be informed about what they can share and not share safely from their perspective, but also not feel so shut down and disempowered that they can't effectively use the healthcare, mental health care services available to them. And then discussing what's medically necessary, like we can process trauma without putting the content of that trauma experience in explicitly. It sounds like those are some of the ways to be, like, just thinking about it and being discerning and thoughtful in that process.
And I also think that now more than ever, providing access to mental health services through telehealth is very important.
Yeah.
Because they can do so from the safety of wherever they are.
Yeah.
To be.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that being able to provide telehealth services is actually like a great advantage to leverage, so that people can still get healthcare while they're navigating, maybe feeling more unsafe, just like being out in their communities at large. Yeah, and again, like, your perspective as like a lawyer and a clinical social worker and an advocate is just so incredibly helpful. Is there anything else that you think that therapists should be thinking about doing outside of the therapy room in terms of advocacy, in terms of community support? I think you've already named some, but anything else that, just in terms of utilizing our voices or capacity to advocate for unaccompanied children and adolescents and immigrants more broadly, what would you suggest?
Yes, I think as clinicians, we can volunteer to conduct mental health evaluations in support of immigration cases. This is part of the work that I do, I and many other therapists do. These evaluations are really important because they help explain why the person had to migrate, what traumatic experiences they encountered in the country of origin that made them migrate, and what is the mental health impact of those experiences and what that looks like here, like what does trauma look like in this specific person. And so these mental health evaluations can be very helpful for whoever is adjudicating the case, whether it's an immigration judge or an asylum officer, in understanding who they are judging, who they have in front of them. And it's also a way of providing psychoeducation. For example, I can say this particular person may use laughter as a coping mechanism. So if you ask her about the assault or about whatever happened and she giggles or she laughs, know that this is not because she thinks it's funny, because she didn't think it was, because it didn't impact her negatively, because she's lying. It has everything to do with it being a trauma response. There's so much need for this and so little information on this. This is one of the trainings that I facilitate, is exactly on this, on how to interview for and write the reports of these evaluations so that they can be submitted as evidence. Yeah, right.
Yeah, it's so critical. And I think just going back to what you were saying about that first interaction with law enforcement, that is the first line that is trying to ascertain details about the rationality for asylum seeking from these children, for all the reasons you said, that they're still actively in a traumatized state, still not safe, still not in a secure place, acutely offbeat loss or separation experiences, but then shutting down, being quiet because of that being an adaptive survival skill probably that they've developed because of persecution in their own countries, and then that being interpreted as like a lack of trauma experience, a lack of a rationality for asylum, and just how important that the eyes of trained mental health professionals could be and should be in this process. I think that's such a great call to action. If this is on your heart and mind, that if you have the capacity to lend your time and energy to doing these critical evaluations and providing those insights, that context, being able to language it and translate how the person is presenting versus like how that actually matches up with their lived experience and why they need to be here and why they need to be protected. So yeah, absolutely. Could talk to, like, there could be like just a million offshoots of different conversations around this. I know that you could speak about this for hours and hours. You're such an expert and just come with such incredible wisdom. Can you share with our audience where people can find you, find more about the important work that you're doing? I know you do all sorts of incredible trainings, including, as you mentioned, about how to do these evaluations. Yeah, where can people connect with you and learn more?
Sure. Thank you very much. So I have a website. It's brendapunski.org. So BRENDAPUNSKY.org. And there you can find information about the different services that I provide, including therapy. In addition to doing therapy with this population, I also do therapy with the professionals serving this population. Other therapists, legal providers, medical providers, people doing interpreting services, case managers, anyone working with this population. Also, I provide clinical supervision of other mental health providers and trainings on the experiences and needs of unaccompanied immigrant children and families, on trauma and mental health services specifically for unaccompanied children and families. As we mentioned, on how to do the mental health evaluations for immigration processes, and on vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress. And please feel free to take a look at the website to find more information, and my contact information is there too.
I'll make sure to include all of that in the show notes because I know people are going to be really eager to connect. Yeah, thank you so much. So incredible. Please come back anytime. Such an important topic, always, but incredibly right now. It's just, I think, helpful to hear what can we do? How can we actually contribute? Because I think a lot of clinicians are feeling pretty powerless right now. And I think you just are giving such clear insights, like how we can actually use our education and our experience to do some good and be of service, to show up for unaccompanied minors and their families.
Thank you very much. Yes, I appreciate the interest and people who are doing this work as well. And of course, having this space to advocate for this population and for people to work with this population.
Right. Right.